What's tattletale journalism, Glenn? You had a great piece last week, which ruffled a lot of feathers as usual. But can you talk a little bit about that?
So for me, my ideas of journalism were defined by my experiences when I was a kid. I was incredibly obsessed with two journalistic stories in particular, one of which was All the President's Men. I watched the film 100 times. I was obsessed with the book when I was like 8 or 9. I used to like study the glossary at the front of the book about who everybody was. And, to the extent that my 8 and 9 year old brain could process it, I mean, it was an incredibly compelling drama because it was about, just talking now, the kind of fictional narrative that was presented, these, intrepid, kind of outsiders who took on the most powerful forces in the world and exposed high level corruption and lying and took them down. And then the other story that was equally compelling for me was the Pentagon Papers and the role that Daniel Ellsberg played in that, in partnership with the New York Times, where he risked his liberty and his life to expose systemic lying on the part of the Pentagon about the Vietnam War over the course of many years, and almost went to prison for life, would have had the Nixon administration not gotten caught engaging in misconduct. So for me, journalism, and then when I started gradually and reluctantly thinking myself as one, always meant using the techniques of reporting, of analysis, of revelation to take on power centers and to reveal serious malfeasance and corruption on the part of the most powerful in the society. That's for me what journalism is about. The things I'm proudest of in my career are obviously like the Snowden story where we did that, the work we did in Brazil where we did that, some of the exposés I've done on the animal agriculture industry, and the journalism I respect most has that as its core hallmark. So much of modern journalism over the last 5 to 10 years, kind of with the advent of digital journalism, is exactly the opposite of that. It has nothing to do with confronting power centers or about exposing serious corruption. It's often devoted to humiliating and destroying the lives of people who don't wield much power. They don't think the CIA or the Pentagon or Wall Street or Silicon Valley are power centers. They think like old ladies in Florida who unwittingly post, events on their Facebook page, supposedly sponsored by or engineered by the Russians, are the ones who you go and bravely confront on their front lawn, or, like obscure citizens who post conspiratorial memes or on 4chan or whatever. These are the people that they like really want to go and confront, not any like real power centers, but just like ordinary people who have thoughts that are different than theirs. Or to the extent that they do want to go confront powerful people, and the incident that precipitated that article about tattletale journalism was about a New York Times reporter, tech reporter, Taylor Lorenz, who was infiltrating this new app called Clubhouse that is used by a lot of Silicon Valley people and increasingly celebrities and media personalities to talk in a more or less quasi-private way. Okay, fair enough. Like obviously a Silicon Valley billionaire is somebody who's part of a real power center. You should be investigating him, but she didn't go into Clubhouse to expose, say, antitrust violations or monopolistic behavior or labor abuses. She went in to go to catch him saying a bad word, and got so excited when she heard the word retarded or retard in connection with the GameStop Reddit controversy, which is the word that they use to describe themselves. And she ran onto Twitter and falsely accused someone, Mark Andreessen, the Silicon Valley billionaire who founded Netscape, of having, in her words, said the R word slur. And it was completely false. He actually wasn't the person who said that. She wrongly identified the person who did. But to me, that was tattletale journalism. It's like either focusing on people who don't have real power at the expense of those who do, or, as in this case, trying to harm them through the most trivial, infantile, adolescent transgressions rather than doing the real dangerous and important and intrepid work to expose serious wrongdoing by them.
Well, I just thought it was interesting that in this case, it was like she accused someone of saying the word retard or retarded, attributed it to the wrong person, didn't give the context.
What's the quote again? We can stay retarded longer than you can.
Yeah, she not only like vilified the wrong person who said it, but also posted the photos of the other people who were in the room because they were guilty of not objecting.
Silence. But silence is complicity.
Right. So I think, I covered the Reddit GameStop controversy. I was very interested in. I know Matt reported on it as well. I believe you talked about it on your show too, Katie. So one of their battle cries was, we can stay retarded longer than you can stay solvent, meaning like we can keep stupidly inflating the price of this stock for as long as we want, which you consider stupid and retarded. They were not like using it maliciously. They were using it ironically. Longer than you can stay solvent, meaning longer than you can maintain your short positions and get out of them. But the reference that Taylor jumped out of her desk to go to report to the teacher was not that. It was the fact that someone in the course of discussing this Reddit GameStop episode simply reported truthfully that they referred to themselves as waging a retard revolution. They quoted the actual phrase used by the Redditors. No, they didn't use it as a slur. They didn't use it to refer to people who were cognitively impaired. They simply described exactly the phrase that was used by the people who they were gathered to discuss. This is really easy to mock, but I think there's something really odious going on here, and it connects to what I'm sure you guys have talked about, or we will talk about, which is the firing of the New York Times reporter Don McNeil for having used the N-word in a context that everybody acknowledges was non-malicious and not even racist. Perhaps inappropriate, but he was doing it to reference a specific comment that was made that used that word in order to try and answer a question that had been asked about him about what was the proper recrimination. And the African-American editor-in-chief of the New York Times investigated that incident when it resurfaced and said, look, I don't think it was the right thing to do, but given that he had no malicious intent, this is not a firing offense. We've spoken to him, we've taken some action, but that's all there is to it. And 150 New York Times newsroom employees wrote in a letter complaining, wanting their colleague more aggressively punished than management had decided. Imagine they're in a union demanding that a fellow union member be punished more severely by management than management had decided was warranted. And their argument was intent does not matter. Intent doesn't matter. This is the argument of the New York Times newsroom employees who wanted Don McNeil fired, is that intent doesn't matter. And once you say intent doesn't matter, then it means that if you find somebody who is suffering from Down syndrome and you walk up to them and say, you're a fucking retard.
Well, maybe we should tell that to Rain Man, because he practically bankrupted a casino and he was a retard.
A despicable act that's indistinguishable in all ways, ethically, morally, than factually describing the sociology and anthropology of the Reddit subculture that led to the GameStop stock price going up simply by describing it. They're indistinguishable acts under this completely anti-intellectual and corrupted rubric, but that was the framework under which people like Taylor Lorenz are functioning, that if a word is harmful to other people, it doesn't matter what the intent is of the person who used it. I think this is one of the things that has gotten overlooked in the discussion of whatever you want to call it, woke ideology, cancel culture, just like generally repressive discourse, rules that have really accelerated over the last 9 months. Oftentimes we focus on the ways in which the range of opinions that are permissible to be expressed without suffering serious recriminations has narrowed greatly. So this week, for instance, Nathan Robinson, the leftist editor of Current Affairs, was fired from his job as a Guardian columnist because of a tweet that he posted very whimsically and obviously satirically, mocking U.S. policy toward Israel about being too supportive and too loyal to Israel. He got fired because he expressed an opinion that the Guardian does not regard as within the realm of acceptable discourse.
He made it clear, by the way, in a follow-up tweet, just so people know, he made it clear that he was not even being serious, because it's relevant because they accused it of being kind of fake news. But anyway, sorry.
Right, exactly. I mean, he it was so obvious that he was, being satirical, but then he quickly added, for those who are satire impaired, like, obviously I don't mean this literally, I'm just making this point. So that's kind of a classic case of how we talk about it, right? Is that you express an opinion and then you get fired for having expressed the wrong opinion. I think the much more odious effect of all of this is the way in which it's corrupting actual journalism, reporting. So, for example, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter and Antifa protest over the summer, there was a lot of violence as part of those protests, a lot of property destruction. Obviously, you can debate validly whether property destruction and even violence was justified given the cause, whether the amount of the violence was really something we should be concerned with, whether it was the fault of the police primarily, who provoked it. Those are all legitimate debates, although we're not allowed to have those. But the thing that bothered me more is that there was almost no reporting on the effects of those protests in small communities and on small businesses by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by CNN, by NBC, because they were petrified of doing fucking reporting, of just informing the public what the impact was of the most historically significant protest in 5 decades in the United States, because they were petrified that by doing the reporting, they would look like they were anti-Black Lives Matter. And it took like Michael Tracy to get into his shitty broken down little car, fueled literally by like PayPal donations, and go around with his crappy little cell phone and like interview weeping, third generation immigrants about watching their dry cleaner store burn down to the ground, or their first generation immigrants who watched their pharmacy or their restaurant burn down to the ground. And then finally, Nellie Bowers somehow put into the newspaper like 4 months later, even though she's a tech reporter, some reporting about how a lot of people who had their businesses destroyed by those protests did not, in fact, have insurance to cover the damage. But this is what's happening over and over. It's not just that it's restricting what opinions you can express, it's restricting what you're allowed to even tell the public about what is going on. And this is something that, I think has not been sufficiently appreciated, and maybe I haven't even paid enough attention to trying to identify and describe it, is that during the Trump years, American politics changed so radically because Trump became the singular and sole prism through which people evaluated where they resided politically. So that if Bill Kristol was opposed to Trump, it meant that Bill Kristol was your ally, no matter what else he might think. He was opposed to Trump, and that's all that matters. So there were this whole series of institutions: Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the security state, that were deeply opposed to Trump. Russiagate came out of the CIA. All those guys like John Brennan and James Clapper and Michael Hayden, became among the leading denouncers of Trump. Robert Mueller, who was George Bush's FBI director after 9/11, obviously became a symbol of it as well. So it took all of these journalists whose principal job is supposed to be adversarial to these institutions, and it enmeshed them in these institutions because they looked at the CIA and the FBI and Wall Street and Silicon Valley as their partners.
The aspect of it that blows my mind is that, well, there's many aspects of it that blow my mind. The first one is that it includes the intelligence agencies. What the hell? Like, since when have they been part of the liberal consensus? That's just almost too strange.
And they were getting, those institutions were using these journalists to feed them the propaganda that they wanted disseminated, which is beneficial to those journalists. So they had a very symbiotic relationship, and they got trained, especially these younger journalists whose history begins in like 2015, whose knowledge of history begins in 2015, to view these institutions not just as benign, but as noble.
I mean, I've been a liberal all my adult life, and I never regarded the intelligence agencies as allies or friends.
So they have no interest at all in going and investigating Goldman Sachs or derivative traders or short sellers or hedge funds or monopolists in Silicon Valley, let alone when do you ever hear on CNN or MSNBC or in the New York Times op-ed page anyone ever talking about the evils of the CIA? Ever. It's not even on their radar. It's not on their radar. They're obsessed with the Proud Boys and QAnon and, like meme makers on 4chan. Those are the power centers that they care about. And all of the others are ones that they're in bed with and aligned with and captive to. This is always the argument that I was making during the twice repeated idiocy with the Bernie bro narrative that you guys have talked a lot about. The argument was never that there were no adherents to Bernie Sanders who were abusive or misogynistic or racist or otherwise engaged. Of course there were. He had millions and millions of followers. Right. Of course, some of them were bad people or saying and doing bad things. The argument was every faction has people doing those kinds of things. It's not unique in any way to one faction. It's you assemble enough human beings, and some of them are going to say and do bad things. So there is no social media platform on the planet where you don't find racist or misogynistic or xenophobic or homophobic or transphobic sentiments, where we're human beings, we're tribal, we have biases, we have prejudices. Sometimes it's being done for reasons unrelated to a genuine belief in those. Maybe people use that to vent their frustrations with their lives or their work or their family or whatever. So of course you can go on 4chan and find some hideous content, just like you could have gone on Parler and found hideous content there. The argument, though, is that if you're going to, use your journalistic platform to combat societal pathologies, you have to make choices about what are the really threatening and menacing ones and what are the more trivial and insignificant ones. So it isn't that, journalists who sit around all day trolling 4chan for like racist memes are making things up or are talking about a problem that's non-existent. Of course, there are racist memes on 4chan. It'd be better for the society if we didn't have people posting those. But in the scheme of what 320 million Americans endure, or 7 or 8 billion people on the planet endure, those problems are a tiny little blip on the radar compared to neoliberalism and corporatism and militarism and the dominant prevailing ideology that has emerged in the West. And if you're spending extremely valuable journalistic resources and platforms like people have if they work for CNN or NBC or the New York Times on trivial problems and none of your time on real power centers, that's the critique, not that those problems are non-existent or even that they're not actually problematic. They very well might be. It's just a very warped and bizarre choice to make in terms of priorities.
I think that's true. I do, though, think that like we can also just acknowledge that 4chan, it's not like incidental, right? From what I know about 4chan, it's not like an incidentally like it's not a bug, it's a feature, right? Isn't a lot of what 4chan does is focus on these. And I think the issue isn't like the judgment of it, it's what should be done about it or the focus on it, to proportionate or disproportionate focus on it.
I mean, just in the scheme of what societal problems exist in the United States and what affect people's lives, I think 4chan is more a mirror reflecting what's happened rather than a cause. Kind of like I saw Donald Trump as a reflection of societal pathologies, right? Rather than a cause. So I'm much more interested in trying to understand what is it about the United States and the way we're ordering our society that is causing so many people to be that disaffected, that they want, I mean, the game of trying to like control the internet to silence them or deny them a platform, it's both impossible and counterproductive. So, I also have to say, like for a lot, like there was a big overlap between the ethos on 4chan and the ethos on the subreddit thread Wall Street Bets that led to the GameStop uprising. A lot of the memes were the same. A lot of the discourse was the same. It clearly came out of this kind of like disaffected, transgressive right wing. There was very little left wing politics there. I mean, except to the extent that they're railing against the evils of Wall Street and the, anger over the 2008 financial crisis, which should be a big part of left wing politics, but as we were discussing, isn't. But it wasn't. There was zero wokeism. So I think we just need to be careful that like sometimes a lot of what's being expressed on the internet is being expressed in terms of embittered irony, anger over prevailing institutions that definitely does offend the ears of, liberal sensibilities, but doesn't necessarily come from a place of malice, but comes from a place of just feeling as though the society has shut its doors in your face. Look at that GameStop Reddit episode where recognizing all the complexities, that there's no clean David versus Goliath narrative, that there were big players on both sides, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever else is true, there was a movement that came out of something that was very much not like left cultural politics. It was a very different kind of brew that gave rise to it. And it was driven by righteous economic populism that populists on both the right and the left are comfortable expressing and have been advocating for years, which is the idea that there are these economic elites who rule Wall Street and use their economic wealth to control the government at the expense of everybody else. And it was basically just like a kind of, in one way, very focused and directed, but in another way, just kind of like
emotion driven for sure.
Yeah, very emotion driven. Fuck you. They didn't think they were taking down Wall Street. They thought they were inflicting pain on some randomly, like they didn't hate Melvin Capital in particular. That just happened to be the target that they were able to harm. And if so it was extraordinary, right? That like, whatever else is true, there were these group of like ordinary people buried in college debt, suffering from the 2008 financial crisis, using their $1,000 stimulus checks to fuck over billionaire hedge fund managers just to do it because they're angry about the injustice. An incredibly important story, in my opinion, one that revealed not only the inequities that we so often overlook because we rarely talk about it for the reasons we were just talking about earlier, but also the capacity of citizens to band together to actually inflict harm on that, to destabilize that order. It was incredibly consequential and inspiring, in my opinion.
They also had to, not to interrupt, they also had to understand the mechanics of how they've been screwed over for so long in order to do it themselves. You know what I mean?
It was very sophisticated.
Yeah,
it was very sophisticated. I mean, I learned more from reading those Reddit boards about like that part of finance than I've learned like in years from reading the financial press. You're exactly right. That's one of the things that made it so impressive is it wasn't just, Antifa gathering with like 1,000 people to just burn down some like small business owner's store. It was very sophisticated and smart, and like it did the work to really understand the damage that it could inflict. But if you read through the board, the subreddit thread with a different perspective, what you're going to find are people saying all kinds of politically incorrect things. They're going to be saying things that get you canceled on college campuses, using retard with extreme frequency, making fun of their own autism and the autism of others, making jokes about women that are absolutely prohibited in good, decent, liberal circles. And you have to choose what you think is the more important component of that story. And a lot of the media coverage ended up being not about what Matt just described, this kind of like final like attempt to reckon with the wreckage of the 2008 financial crisis and the evil people who got away with it completely and still profit from it. But, I found some like stray, racist comments in these Reddit threads. There's probably like a white supremacist movement behind this. And that's what's done constantly, is at the expense of the much more significant, difficult but important storyline of ordinary people destabilizing the hedge fund hierarchy. Instead, you just grab some Reddit comments, throw it up, or Telegram comments, throw it up online. They're racist. They get people's emotions high. And suddenly you've discredited all of the suffering and all of the deprivation that has motivated this all to happen in the first place. And of course, as Matt then says, those people feel that rightly, that the media is one of the arms that is oppressing them.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about it doesn't sound like it's important, but it felt to me very consequential. The Andrea Mitchell talking about Ted Cruz.
Oh yeah, can someone break this down?
Yeah, so Ted Cruz quoted Shakespeare during the impeachment hearing.
Yeah, just the quote was, "It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." He quoted that to describe how he viewed impeachment.
Right. So Andrea Mitchell then goes on Twitter and blasts him for not knowing, for mistakenly thinking that it was Shakespeare and not realizing that it was William Faulkner, who of course wrote a novel, The Sound and the Fury, that was, you know, based on that quote from Shakespeare. And then that was silly and that was a mistake and it happens. But the funnier thing was that she was suddenly sort of subtweeted by all of the hashtag resistance all-stars from, you know, Jennifer Rubin on, saying, basically cheerleading this comment. And I just thought it was representative of, you know, a lot of people look at these sort of elite journalistic celebrities not just as people who ignore them or are snobs, but also people who just aren't that smart and are often wrong. And when episodes like that just seem to underscore that whole dynamic. I don't know. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, you know, obviously, on the one hand, Andrea Mitchell mistaking a quote, misattributing a quote that was written by Shakespeare to Faulkner is a completely trivial matter.
Completely. Yeah.
But she thought it was important enough to show everybody that Ted Cruz was an idiot, that he can't even like properly quote Shakespeare. And the reason why she did that is because embedded in the sense of liberal superiority is this idea that conservatives are imbeciles. They're uneducated, they're primitive, they're not sophisticates. And she knew exactly what she was doing. She's a smart woman. She's been around for decades. She's on MSNBC, a network watched almost exclusively by liberals. So she was trying to say, like, hey, look at me and us. Aren't we the smart ones? We're illiterate, and these are illiterate idiots. They can't even quote Shakespeare. So it isn't that her mistake was important. What was important was the reason she thought it was worthwhile to use her platform to do it, which is to reinforce the liberal idea that conservatives are uneducated cretins, that they're just kind of like Neanderthals. And conservatives know this. So, and then, and what was amazing was, as Matt said, was there are actually all these like blue check journalists who were replying to Andrea Mitchell saying like, yeah, can you believe what an imbecile Ted Cruz is? Like revealing that they too didn't know the difference between Faulkner and Shakespeare.
And but couldn't Google it.
Right. And like, it's fine. Like, I don't think it's like, you know,
fireball offense or disqualifying. Yeah.
It's nothing like we study. I don't know when the last time I read Shakespeare. It was like decades ago. I don't sit around reading Shakespeare. I don't pretend to. You know, I probably read it last in college. So I don't think it's a big deal. But like they all had to feign that they too, of course, knew that Ted Cruz had made this mistake. And it just revealed so much about not just the liberal mindset, but the way in which they try and humiliate conservatives all the time. And the fact that she just got it completely. It's kind of like the Taylor Lorenz thing. It's like, it wouldn't have mattered even if she got it right.
But the fact that she got it wrong makes it that much more embarrassing or
The Andrea Mitchell thing, it feels like it's all part of the same, just to bring it back to GameStop, it's the same attitude of we know better. We're the people who have the knowledge. Like when the GameStop thing happened, you had Andrew Ross Sorkin going on television saying, these people just don't understand how the markets work. If they really knew, they wouldn't do this. Whereas the reality was what this story exposed was these people, the people who shorted shorted GameStop were really sloppy, didn't really know what they were doing. And they're not any smarter really than all these amateurs online who are using the same tools to analyze the same stocks. And just the inability to recognize that veil of intellectual superiority is being punctured all the time. I just feel like they're constantly doing a disservice to the image of the media. I don't know.
So let me just tell you two quick stories that are like for me kind of illustrative and were revealing when I experienced them. The first one is my mother, who passed away in late 2019. She worked until like the last day she died at this like company that sold parts for like for airplanes. So it was like it wasn't like she didn't work in a factory, but she worked in like an office with the people who just like did the customer service for the people who were buying the parts to the airplanes. And she loved her work. She she was 76 when she died. She was on Social Security. She didn't need to work, but she wanted to work. She loved the people with whom she worked. She'd rather do that than sit at home. She used to tell me all the time how much fun they had. They would argue about politics. And so one time I went and visited, and she's like, "Oh, you have to come in. I want you to meet them all. And, they watch you on TV." And she wanted to show me off, but also she wanted me to meet her friends. So I went in. It was like this super diverse office, immigrants from Jamaica, African Americans, Hispanics, because it's South Florida, Jews, Italians. And it was raucous. And they started talking about politics, and they started making fun of each other using ethnic and religious humor that took my breath away. It was oh my God, you can't say that. But they were that for them, it's just how they speak. They were friends with each other. They understood the context of it. They understood the intent behind it. And from my kind of ears that are constantly being shaped by elite political discourse and am kind of confined by it, it was shocking to me. And it made me realize right at that moment how removed these kind of cultural mores are that happen at the elite level from the people who they claim they're speaking for. And the other similar episode that I had that was really eye-opening was when the Reality Winner debacle at The Intercept happened. I happened to be in Milwaukee, where I was working on a potential story that didn't pan out. And I was sitting at this diner in a suburb of Milwaukee, a working class suburb. And next to me was this group of 6, guys in their late 30s, late 20s, early 30s. And they were on their phone, and it was there was a big New York Times story on the Reality Winner thing. And they started talking about it. And they were saying, oh yeah, their claim is there was a document showing the Russians hacked into the voting machine. And then they all started saying it's just all this stuff is always anonymous. You just can't figure out whose interest it is to claim this. There's never any evidence shown. I really don't know what to believe. And I was that is so much more rational and informed and sober and centered and thoughtful than anything that you can plug into on professional, political, and journalistic Twitter at any moment, just being basically skeptical, using common sense application. They weren't believing it nor disbelieving it because they recognized the evidence was insufficient to do so, that there might be. And I just realized at the time that, of course, people who work in journalism and politics in DC would think that those people were utterly unqualified to speak about politics. And yet in reality, their native intelligence was so much greater.
I also always thought, Matt and I disagreed about this, I think, a little bit, but I also think that there's an important discussion to be had about, property discussion. Property destruction and physical violence, which again, I think these things can be,
Sure, but those
protest movements had both.
Right.
Yeah, but I think a lot of
you have to cover it. You have to cover it. And B, you do have to cover it, right? And then that way, so people can get an understanding of the impact of it, the magnitude of it. But then also, there was a lot of physical violence as part of those protests. Also, there were police officers killed in those protests. There were protesters who were killed. There were Trump supporters who were killed. There was a lot of violence in the protests over the summer, violence to human beings, not just to property.
Yeah, I'm just saying that I think there's a problem with the way some journalists use that term without distinguishing between those two things.
That's fair.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point.
Yeah. Glenn, thank you so much. The piece is on Substack, obviously. You're at greenwald@substack.com.